She attended parties she wasn't invited to for free food until the greed nearly killed her. In a quiet neighborhood in Lagos, there lived a woman whose appetite for free food was only matched by her complete lack of shame. For years, Clara had perfected the art of the uninvited arrival, the subtle walk through gates she wasn't supposed to enter, the confident nod at security guards who didn't know her, the practiced smile that made her seem like she absolutely belonged there. But what started as harmless freeloading would soon turn into something far darker, something that would change the trajectory of her entire existence in ways she could never have imagined. This is the story of Clara, the professional party crasher, and the day her greed finally caught up with her in the most unexpected and horrifying way possible. Clara was not poor. This was perhaps the most important detail about her entire story. She wasn't a woman forced by circumstances to crash parties or beg for food. She had a job, a decent one at that, working as a receptionist at a busy law firm in the heart of the city. She earned a respectable salary that could have provided her with all the food she needed, all the clothes she wanted, and a comfortable life. But somewhere along the way, something had twisted inside her mind, a peculiar psychology that made free things feel infinitely more valuable than purchased ones. It wasn't about survival. It was about the thrill. The rush of getting something for nothing. The satisfaction of beating the system. Every party she crashed without an invitation felt like a victory, a personal conquest against the organized world that tried to keep people like her out. And more than anything, it was about the food. Clara's obsession with party food had begun innocuously enough. Years ago, she had attended a wedding of a distant cousin, one where she was actually invited, and the experience had awakened something primal within her. The abundance of it all. The tables laden with platters of jollof rice, mountains of fried rice in every possible variation, chicken so tender it fell off the bone, beef so succulent it melted on the tongue. There were small chops, spring rolls, puff-puff, meat pies, samosas all arranged in artistic displays. There were elaborate salads, exotic fruits, desserts that looked too beautiful to eat. And the drinks. Champagne, wine, exotic juices, everything flowing freely. That first experience had planted a seed in her mind. Why should she ever pay for a meal again when there were events happening almost every single day in her neighborhood? The streets of Lagos were always buzzing with celebrations, naming ceremonies, birthday parties, engagements, weddings, funeral events. There was always something happening, always tables of food waiting for anyone bold enough to just show up and partake. So she started small. A naming ceremony 3 blocks away. She simply walked in with a wrapper tied confidently around her waist as if she belonged there, smiled at a few people, and made her way to the food table. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her presence. By the time the actual hosts realized they had an extra mouth to feed, Clara had already filled multiple plates and was halfway through her first helping. That first successful crash was exhilarating. She felt like a criminal who had pulled off the perfect heist, except instead of money or jewels, her prize was fried rice and grilled chicken. She left that party with food piled high in the plastic containers she always carried in her bags that she had strategically started keeping empty for exactly this purpose. After that first success, there was no turning back. Week after week, Clara became a fixture at neighborhood events. She developed a system, a methodology born from countless repetitions. She would dress in her best wrapper and blouse, something that looked festive but not too new, nothing that would make her stand out. She would time her arrival for when the party was in full swing, when there were enough people present that one more face wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. She would find a spot near the food table, pick up a plate, and begin filling it with the confidence of someone who had been on the guest list all along. The hosts of these parties rarely paid attention. They were too busy with their actual invited guests, too occupied with managing logistics and dealing with relatives. And the guests themselves. Most of them didn't care. Everyone was too focused on enjoying themselves to spend energy questioning whether every person they saw belonged there. It was the perfect system, really. Clara had essentially cracked the code of free food acquisition. But as time went on, something dark began to develop. Her greed wasn't satisfied with just attending one party a week. Soon, she was going to multiple events every single Saturday. She began to view these parties not as occasional treats but as her primary source of food. Her refrigerator at home was often empty, not because she couldn't afford to stock it, but because she saw no reason to buy food when she could just harvest it from the social events happening around her. This was where Clara crossed an invisible moral line that many people didn't even know existed. She wasn't just taking a plate of food and leaving. She was becoming gluttonous in a way that was genuinely affecting the other guests. She would load her plate so high that food would sometimes fall off the edges. She would go back for second and third helpings while people who were actually invited were being served their first plates. On occasions, the food would run out before all the legitimate guests had been fed, and it was often because Clara had eaten enough for 3 people. Yet she never saw anything wrong with this. In her mind, she had found a loophole in society, a way to live that others were simply too timid to attempt. She felt clever. She felt superior to the people who actually paid for their meals like fools. Her colleagues at work had no idea what she was doing. To them, she seemed fine, normal, occasionally flashing designer bags and new clothes that she purchased with money she wasn't spending on food. The neighbors, however, knew exactly what was happening. They whispered about her. They watched as she would rush out every Saturday morning, dressed to the nines, scanning the streets for signs of celebrations. They saw her return home in the evenings with containers of food, sometimes so many containers that she had to make multiple trips from her car to her apartment. They gossiped about her shamelessness, her complete lack of decorum or consideration for others. But Clara didn't care about their judgment. She had developed an almost impenetrable shield of self-justification. This went on for years. Years of crashing parties, years of collecting free food, years of operating with complete impunity. The number of events she had infiltrated was probably in the hundreds. She had eaten at naming ceremonies, weddings, birthday parties, engagements, anniversaries, corporate events, family reunions, and even a few funeral receptions, though she drew a line at those eventually, deciding that even her shamelessness had some boundaries. Clara had become legendary in the neighborhood, though not in the way she would have wanted. Mothers would point her out to their daughters as a cautionary tale. Security personnel at popular event venues would be shown her photograph and warned to watch out for her. There were even whispered stories about how at certain parties, when the hosts realized Clara had shown up uninvited, they would deliberately reduce the portions or hide some of the better food items. But still, she persisted. Because the draw of that free food, that thrill of the uninvited arrival, had become something she genuinely could not resist. The day everything changed began like any other Saturday morning in Clara's life. She woke up, checked the neighborhood WhatsApp groups where events were usually announced, and her eyes caught on a particular message that made her heart sing with anticipation. There was a wedding happening. Not just any wedding, but a big one. The kind of wedding that would have tables upon tables of food, professional catering, multiple types of dishes, and enough abundance to feed an army. The groom and bride were from prominent families in the area, families known for their wealth and their willingness to spare no expense when it came to celebrations. The wedding was scheduled to start at 2 p.m., which meant Clara had the entire morning to prepare. She stood in front of her mirror, selecting her outfit with care. The wrapper had to be elegant but not too expensive looking. The blouse had to be stylish but not so fashionable that it would mark her as either an insider or an obvious outsider. She had learned long ago that blending in was an art form, and she was a master. By 1:30 p.m., Clara was making her way toward the event venue, a beautifully decorated garden space on the outskirts of the neighborhood. Fairy lights were already being strung up, tables were being arranged, and the atmosphere was electric with the energy of preparation. She could already smell the food, the rich aroma of well-seasoned jollof rice, the unmistakable smell of grilled meat, the sweetness of pastries and desserts. What Clara didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known as she walked toward that venue with her usual confidence, was that this particular wedding had someone very different from the usual hosts in charge of security and guest management. The bride's aunt, a woman named Auntie Tunday, had taken it upon herself to oversee the event planning and execution. Auntie Tunday was known throughout the neighborhood for 2 things, her legendary strictness and her absolute intolerance for nonsense of any kind. Auntie Tunday had been hosting and attending events in the neighborhood for decades, and she had watched with growing frustration as the problem of party crashers had become increasingly prevalent. She had seen uninvited guests eating food meant for legitimate attendees. She had witnessed the disrespect, the audacity, the sheer lack of consideration that these people displayed. More than anything, she saw it as a personal affront, a violation of the sanctity of celebration, a mockery of the effort and expense that hosts undertook to make their events special. This time, she decided, things would be different. This time, she would teach a lesson that would be remembered. When she heard whispers about Clara from other neighbors, heard the stories about the woman who had become famous for her uninvited arrivals, something crystallized in her mind. A plan began to form. Auntie Tunday arranged for a separate food station to be set up in a back area of the kitchen. This food was identical to what would be served to the actual guests, same dishes, same presentation, same quality. But there was one crucial ingredient that was added only to this food: industrial-strength laxatives, mixed in carefully so that they couldn't be detected by taste or sight. She also made sure that the food was slightly contaminated, not dangerously so, but enough to cause the stomach upset that laxatives alone might not achieve. She then instructed the security team to allow anyone without a proper invitation into the party, but to quietly direct them toward the back entrance where they would be served from the special food station. Auntie Tunday was not a cruel woman in her heart, but she had convinced herself that what she was doing was justice. These people were thieves of a sort, thieves of hospitality, thieves of respect, thieves of resources. They deserved to face consequences. Clara arrived at the venue at approximately 2:15 p.m., right when things were getting into full swing. The garden was now crowded with well-dressed guests, the tables were fully laden with food, and the atmosphere was festive and joyful. She walked through the gate with her usual confidence, nodding at the security guard in a way that suggested she absolutely belonged there. The security guard, who had been briefed by Auntie Tunday, watched her arrive. He recognized her immediately, not because he knew her personally, but because her description matched exactly what he'd been told to watch for. The woman who crashed parties. The woman with the distinctive way of walking, the woman who always carried multiple plastic containers. He watched as she made her way through the crowd, and then, following his instructions, he allowed her through without comment. Clara's eyes were immediately drawn to the food tables. She felt that familiar rush of adrenaline, that thrill that had become almost addictive to her. The tables were even more magnificent than she had anticipated. There were different stations set up, one for rice dishes, one for meat and proteins, one for side dishes and vegetables, one for small chops and appetizers, and one for desserts and fruits. But then a member of the catering staff approached her, someone who had been instructed by Auntie Tunday to direct any uninvited guests specifically to the back area. The staff member, following orders, suggested that Clara might enjoy the special food they had prepared in the back kitchen, the special guest area, where there were even more exclusive dishes available. Something in Clara's mind, that part that was always desperate for the best deal, responded immediately. Exclusive dishes? A special guest area? This sounded even better than the main tables. So she allowed herself to be guided to the back, to the special food station that Auntie Tunday had so carefully prepared. And there, spread out before her, was a feast that looked absolutely identical to what was being served to the main guests. Clara felt like she had won the lottery. Not only would she be eating, but she would be eating from an exclusive station, eating foods that were apparently even more special than what everyone else was getting. She didn't hesitate. She began to load her plate, and this time, with the belief that she had somehow gained VIP access, she took even larger portions than usual. She filled a plate with jollof rice, the grains golden and fragrant. She added generous helpings of fried rice, each grain separate and glistening with oil. She piled on chicken, grilled chicken, fried chicken, chicken in sauce. She took amala and pounded yam, the traditional Yoruba dishes that she particularly loved. She added small chops, spring rolls that were still warm, meat pies with their pastry perfectly baked, samosas that looked absolutely delicious. And she didn't stop there. She finished the first plate and immediately went back for another. This time, she filled containers that she had brought with her, packing food to take home. She was operating under the assumption that she had somehow earned some sort of VIP status at this event, that this special food station had been made available for her specifically. The irony of this delusion would later become apparent, but in that moment, she was simply lost in the joy of abundance. She ate and ate and ate. She consumed amounts of food that would have been impressive for 4 or 5 people, let alone one. Her stomach, despite being stretched by years of this behavior, began to distend noticeably. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The food was too good, and the psychological satisfaction of getting it for free while others paid was too intoxicating. It wasn't until she had spent nearly an hour at this back station, until she had filled multiple containers of food, until she felt physically uncomfortable from the amount she had consumed, that she finally decided she had enough. She packed up her containers, thanked the catering staff with a satisfied smile, and made her way back home. Clara arrived at her apartment around 5 p.m., her various containers of food carefully arranged in her kitchen. She felt satisfied, triumphant even. This had been one of her best party crashes ever. She had eaten like a queen, she had procured enough food to last her at least 3 days, and she had somehow managed to find a special station that served even better food than what the regular guests got. She decided to rest for a bit before she started on the leftovers. She settled into her couch, turned on the television, and allowed her heavily laden stomach to begin the process of digestion. At first, everything felt normal. The comfortable fullness that came after a large meal, the pleasant lethargy that usually followed these excursions. But around 6:30 p.m., roughly 90 minutes after she had finished eating, Clara felt the first rumble. It was subtle at first, just a slight stirring in her digestive system, nothing particularly alarming. She initially attributed it to the amount of food she had consumed, thinking that her body simply needed a bit of time to process everything. She got up and made her way to the bathroom. What happened next was something her body had never truly experienced before. She felt as though her intestines were trying to reject everything she had eaten. The sensation was overwhelming, urgent, impossible to ignore. She spent 20 minutes on the toilet, experiencing what she thought was simply the natural consequence of overeating. But here was where Clara made a critical mistake, a decision born from her years of greed and her complete inability to recognize warning signs. After she finished in the bathroom, after she felt temporarily relieved, she looked at the containers of food she had brought home, and rather than disposing of them or letting them rest, she decided to eat more. This was the extent of her greed and her addiction to this behavior. She could feel that something was not quite right with her body, but the food was there, it was free food, and she could not resist. So she went back to eating the same food that was currently causing her body such distress. What happened next was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for days. The second portion of food seemed to trigger something catastrophic in Clara's system. Within minutes of finishing her second plate, she felt the rumbling return, but this time it was more intense, more aggressive, more impossible to ignore. She rushed back to the bathroom, and this time, what occurred was far more severe than the first episode. Her body seemed to have turned against her completely. She experienced both diarrhea and vomiting simultaneously, her body desperately trying to expel everything she had consumed. The pain was unlike anything she had ever felt before, a deep, twisting pain that made her double over, that made her cry out, that made her question whether she was actually dying. She tried to leave the bathroom, thinking that perhaps if she could just lie down, the episode would pass. But within minutes, the urgent need to return was undeniable. She spent the entire evening alternating between her bed and the toilet, each cycle bringing fresh waves of pain and expulsion. By midnight, she was thoroughly dehydrated, her entire body aching, her mind beginning to feel foggy and unclear. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the symptoms had intensified. Her stomach felt hollow, wrung out, as though everything inside her had been violently removed. Yet the diarrhea and vomiting continued. She couldn't keep anything down. Even water seemed to trigger the violent responses. She called in sick to work, unable to imagine moving from her apartment, let alone navigating the commute and the day ahead. By the afternoon of the second day, Clara was in genuine distress. The dehydration was severe enough that she was beginning to feel lightheaded and confused. Her skin felt clammy and cold despite the warm weather. Her lips were dry and cracked. Her entire body felt weak, as though all the muscles had been replaced with water. She had spent so much time on the toilet that her body was now completely depleted of fluids and nutrients. That evening, as evening transitioned into night, Clara found herself alone in her apartment, increasingly desperate and increasingly frightened. She tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, her body would jerk awake with the urgent need to return to the bathroom. Around 11 p.m. on the second night, after what must have been her 50th or 60th trip to the toilet, Clara felt something shift inside her. The world began to spin. Her vision became blurry. Her heart began to pound irregularly in her chest. And then, without warning, everything went black. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Okonkwo, who noticed something was wrong. Clara had not emerged from her apartment in over 36 hours. Her car was still in the parking space, and Mrs. Okonkwo, who was already suspicious about Clara's lifestyle and her frequent return to her apartment with containers of food, became concerned when she heard what sounded like something heavy falling inside the apartment. Mrs. Okonkwo knocked on Clara's door repeatedly, calling out her name. There was no response. Worried that something serious might have happened, she contacted the building management, who agreed to open the apartment using the master key they kept for emergencies. What they found was a scene of absolute devastation. Clara was unconscious on the bathroom floor, her body extremely weak and pale, her apartment in a state of complete disorder. The bathroom itself was in a condition that nobody wanted to think about too deeply. There were containers of food still visible in the kitchen, and the overwhelming smell of sickness permeated the entire space. An ambulance was called immediately. The paramedics who arrived were shocked by Clara's condition. Her vitals were unstable. Her blood pressure was dangerously low. Her heart rate was irregular. She was severely dehydrated and appeared to be suffering from acute food poisoning complicated by something else, something that the paramedics suspected might be related to some sort of toxin or chemical in the food she had consumed. She was rushed to the hospital with sirens blaring, her unconscious body strapped securely to a stretcher, and 4-line already being inserted into her arm as the ambulance raced through the Lagos traffic. At the hospital, Clara was admitted to the emergency ward, where she was immediately put on aggressive rehydration therapy. Doctors ran tests to determine exactly what had caused her condition. The results were shocking. Not only did the food she had consumed contain dangerous levels of laxatives, industrial-strength laxatives that should never be ingested in such quantities, but it also showed signs of bacterial contamination that had triggered severe food poisoning. The combination was devastating to her system. The food poisoning had caused severe inflammation in her digestive tract, while the laxatives had caused her body to expel everything with violent force. Together, they had created a perfect storm of gastrointestinal distress that had nearly killed her. The doctors explained to her, once she was conscious enough to understand, that she was very lucky to be alive. If her neighbors had not found her when they did, if she had remained unconscious for even a few more hours without medical intervention, she could have experienced organ failure or worse. Her body had been pushed to the very brink of what it could endure. The week that followed was one of the most painful and humbling experiences of Clara's life. She remained hospitalized, unable to eat solid food, sustained entirely by poor nutrition and clear fluids. Her body was so damaged by the ordeal that her digestive system needed time to heal. She lost weight rapidly, weight she had gained from years of overconsumption. Her skin became pale and drawn. Her hair seemed to lose its luster. She looked like someone who had been through a war. The physical suffering was one thing. But the psychological suffering was something else entirely. Lying in that hospital bed, with nothing to do but think about what had happened to her, Clara was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about herself. She had been poisoned. Someone had deliberately put something harmful into food knowing that uninvited guests would eat it. And that someone had done it specifically because of people like her, people who crashed parties and disrespected the boundaries that hosts established. She had been the victim of a deliberate act of harm, and yet, she could not escape the realization that she had brought this upon herself through her own behavior. The nurses at the hospital were not particularly sympathetic to her plight. Once they learned from the gossip in the neighborhood how she had contracted the food poisoning through crashing a party and eating food meant as a trap, they treated her with a mixture of pity and judgment. Some of them made comments, not quite loud enough for her to miss, about how greed had its consequences, about how people who tried to get something for nothing always ended up paying a price. By the time Clara was discharged from the hospital after a full week, she was a changed woman. Not changed in the sense that transformation stories usually suggest, not suddenly reformed and full of newfound wisdom. Rather, she was changed in the most basic, most fundamental way. She was traumatized. The memory of those 36 hours of agony, the fear she had felt when she lost consciousness, the humiliation of being found unconscious in her own bathroom, these things had left deep scars. When Clara returned to her neighborhood, she was greeted with a mixture of relief that she had survived and barely concealed schadenfreude about what had happened to her. The story had spread like wildfire through the community. Everyone knew about the woman who had been poisoned at the wedding, everyone knew that she was the famous party crasher, everyone knew the details, or at least their version of the details. The neighbors, who had gossiped about her for years, now had confirmed proof that their suspicions about her activities were justified. They also had a story that would become legendary in the neighborhood, a cautionary tale told to children and young adults. Be respectful, respect boundaries, don't take what isn't yours, or else face the consequences that Clara had faced. Auntie Tunday never publicly acknowledged her role in what had happened. She maintained plausible deniability, suggesting that perhaps the food had simply been contaminated due to careless food handling or storage. But within the neighborhood, whispers circulated about what she had done, and opinions about her actions were divided. Some people, particularly those who hosted events regularly and had dealt with party crashes themselves, viewed Auntie Tunday's actions as justified. They saw Clara's punishment as deserved, as a natural consequence of her behavior. These people spoke of her actions in hushed, approving tones, suggesting that perhaps what Auntie Tunday had done was harsh but necessary, a way to send a message to anyone considering similar behavior. Others, however, were disturbed by what had been done. They argued that while Clara's behavior had been disrespectful and greedy, deliberately poisoning someone crossed a moral line that should never be crossed. They worried about what it meant for their community if people began to see poisoning party crashers as an acceptable response to boundary violations. These people visited Clara during her recovery, expressing their concern and their disagreement with how the situation had been handled. Clara, for her part, found herself in a state of profound isolation. She could not go back to the neighborhood WhatsApp groups where party announcements were made. The very thought of attending another party, even one where she was actually invited, filled her with dread. She had lost her job as a receptionist at the law firm. They had not explicitly fired her, but after her extended absence and her reappearance looking traumatized and weakened, they had suggested that perhaps she should take some time for her health. The suggestion was thin code for being let go. The financial consequences began to mount. Without her job, she couldn't afford the medical bills from her hospitalization, bills that had accumulated quickly despite whatever insurance she had. She found herself forced to actually start purchasing her own food, something she had barely done in years. The experience was humbling and difficult, a daily reminder of how dependent she had become on the free food from party crashing. Months passed. Clara slowly recovered physically, though the psychological scars remained. She could not eat large quantities without feeling anxious. Certain foods, particularly rice dishes, which had been her staple at parties, triggered nausea and dread. She had lost so much weight that her clothes hung off her body. She looked like a ghost of her former self, a walking reminder of what unchecked greed and boundary violation could lead to.